So the purpose of this video is to show you all how to get your grid from the computer that we have just watched in the previous video onto your paper so that you can actually use the grid appropriately, because essentially what you are doing is creating the exact same proportionate grid on your larger piece of paper so that you can then enlarge the animal that you have decided to draw. So these drawings are going to be, or these paintings I should say, are going to be a lot bigger than your reference image, so you will be using scale to basically make a bigger version of the grid, but the main thing is to make sure that you get the correct number of squares going across and going down. So basically turn your page either horizontally like this or vertically depending on the composition that you are doing. As I was discussing in the previous video, my image is going to be 6 across by 8 down. Now, in order to make my page fit onto the screen to where you guys can see it well, I've got it sideways, but I will be doing the image vertically. So the first thing to do is go ahead and start making my hash marks. Remember, we will do hash marks along one side and then all along the other side, and then we will connect those across so that we make sure that our grid is nice and perpendicular. So again, I need 6 going across, which will be the short side for me. So I'm going to lay my ruler down, and the paper is 12 inches. Divide that by 6, you get 2. So every 2 inches I will make a hash mark. And then I'm going to move my ruler down and do the same thing towards the bottom of the page. So at the 2, the 4, the 6, the 8, and the 10. And remember to make sure that you line your ruler up so that the 0 is touching the edge of the paper, not the edge of the ruler. So then those lines will be ready to connect across, in which case you can use a yardstick if you need to. So I've got a yardstick here, and I'm going to go ahead and connect those very lightly across my page. It is really important that you make these lines really light, because you will eventually be erasing them. Make sure that your hash mark, both hash marks, are on the straight edge before you go across. And again, draw nice and light because you will be erasing the grid line. It's really just a guideline because basically you've already got your image on the computer and then it's got a matching grid on it. So what these squares are going to do is just help you match each square to the computer image, so that you can draw things more accurately and proportionately. Not everybody likes the gridding method, and that's perfectly fine. But for this particular assignment, we are going to use the gridding method. After this assignment, you can take it or leave it. So now I'm going to go ahead and go and make my hash marks for the other direction. And it's 18 inches across, and I need to make that into 8 sections. So 8 times 2 is 16. So then, since this is 18 inches, I know I'm going to be going in 1 inch on both sides, and then from the 1 to the 17 will be my 16. So I'm going to make my hash mark at the 1 and at the 17 to show where the top and bottom of my grid are going to be, and then every 2 inches from there. So the exact hash marks and measurements that you use will be determined by the grid that is on the computer. Line my ruler up, do the same thing along the bottom edge. So I'm going to make a mark at the 1 and at the 17 so that I've got the 16 inches in between, and then I'm going to measure out every 2 inches for my markings on that 16-inch space. And then I'm going to go ahead and connect those across. And since my paper is 12 inches, I'm just going to use my smaller ruler. Line it up carefully, draw lightly. Line it up and draw lightly. I am making my lines a little bit darker than I typically would so that you guys can see them better in terms of the video, but you want to barely be able to see your grid lines. And remember to hold your ruler in the middle and kind of press down a little bit so that when you put the ruler or you put the pencil against the ruler or the yardstick, it's not going to slide around on you. So I am just going to go ahead and put a really light little squiggly in here on both ends to remind myself that that is not part of my grid. And then remember, my paper will be turned this way because I'm going to be using 6 across and 8 going down. And now my paper would be ready to go ahead and start drawing my animal very slowly, very carefully based on my image. So I am going to go ahead and pull up my reference image here so that you guys can see. And then I'm going to click on Present. And what clicking on Present does is just make the image bigger so that it is easier for you to see. And then I would go ahead and start with a very loose, very light sort of outline of my entire shape or the entire animal first. And then I would work in with more detail. You do not want to just pick like the face or something and start with that. What you want to do is pick something a bit more basic than that, like the general outline, and then get that part as accurate and correct as possible before you even think about anything internally. Because if you get the line work on the outside correct, then it's going to be much easier to figure out the placement for everything that goes inside. And then, once you get all of that line work correct, the shading, the color, the detail will be a lot more accurate. So I'm just going to start down here, and I'm just going to kind of follow along, paying attention to where things fall in each square. So like this one, for instance, the little white part of his face is about halfway. So I'm going to go ahead and make a mark there. And then I know that that's going to come up about like that. And then it goes to about the 1/4 spot, kind of straight up, and then curls out. And then it's going to go up a little bit here, and then comes about to here, so a little less than halfway, and then it's going to go straight up, and comes over right here so that it crosses right above this intersection. And I've got a little feather here. Got another little feather here. And then sort of that bigger red part starts here and crosses about 2/3 of the way across this square. And then it's going to go up from there. Remember, this is just the overall outline. Comes across here to about the halfway point of this line. And then it comes up, dips back down, comes back up again, and comes to a point right about here. And then crosses back into this square, and then goes back over to about here, and then comes down at about the halfway point of this line, comes almost to here, and then it kind of comes over quite a bit and curls back up and just barely goes into the square, sort of close to the middle section of this spot, and then comes down almost all the way to this corner, and then comes out sort of parallel with this line to about a little more than halfway, and then comes down, and then this comes across directly on this corner piece, comes over almost all the way to this line, and then comes down pretty straight again to about here, and then starts to come out, and then once it gets about here, it's a little less than halfway, so I need to move that this way more. And I am going to go ahead and erase that, even though a lot of times you don't erase until you make the correction. And the reason for that is because if you erase before you make the correction, then chances are you'll make the same mistake. Whereas if you make the corrected line and then erase, you're far less likely to make the same mistake, because you would have to draw over the exact same line again in order to do that. So that might be sort of the very first step of the gridding drawing. So I've got sort of a very big outline of my entire rooster on here, and now before I look into anything internal, what I need to do is go back through that outline and make the outline as exact as possible, so that you are taking the time to make each and every step as accurate as you can, because the earlier you start making things accurate, the better the overall image and result will be. So now I'm just going to go through again and double check everything. So this doesn't come in quite as much, so I'm going to change that line a little bit. And then right about here is where it stops being feathers and starts being his little white thing, so I'm just going to make a little mark there. And then this is going to come up and go out just a little bit here. Then this is going to come from here a little lower, and then come up and out. So I'm just changing things a little bit here, not a lot. So this is a little further out this way. And then comes to a little more of a point here above his eye, and then comes over. Then this one comes a slightly flatter angle here. Comes up, comes across a little bit more. And then goes back behind that space. So this is going to come up here and then go over. And this comes up and then over. Doesn't quite come out as much there. This comes up just a little bit higher here. And then comes in and goes back out here. And then dips down. and curves into this next spot. And this is just a little bit softer here. And this is going to start coming out just a little bit more. And then it comes down. So that might be some of the corrections that I would need to make to that outline. So now that I've made those corrections, I'm going to go ahead and erase some of those original lines that I changed, where I made things more accurate. And then at this point, I am ready to go ahead and start working into some of the more internal parts of the drawing. And I would do them the exact same way. Start with generic, loose outline, gesture, and then go back in with detail layers. So just like shading and coloring, all of that happens with layers, so does drawing. So your first little bit of the drawing might not look like much. But then the more you work on it, the more detail you add, the more accurate you make each part, the better it's going to look. Because the goal here is for these to be recognizable. We are going for realism, but remember that you are also using at least 3 elements. So they may not end up completely realistic, and that's fine. But now, once again, at this point, I would be ready to go ahead and look at the eyes, look at the beak, look at where the different parts of this separate, look at the little part that goes under his beak, different things like that. The exact part that you start with in that process is up to you. For me, I would probably start with the beak, simply because if I look here, this is sort of where the corner of the beak is. So it gives me a very definitive jumping off point for the beginning of that face. And then I could go from there going out. I would do all of that in one sort of light, loose layer, and then I would go back in and add more detail and more specificity to every single part of the interior there. So once again, your first step is going to be, like in the previous video, to create your grid on your paper. Your next step then is going to be to make your grid, the first step is to make your grid on the computer. Second step is to make your grid on your paper, and then start into the silhouette, sort of the outlining steps, and then once you get that as precise as you can, you'll work a little bit more internally.